In defiance of common sense, the further she got from immediate danger, the more frightened Jett became. She'd grown up with tales of the walking dead, for Mr. Averill, Court Oak's overseer, had been a free black and turned a tolerant eye to the conjure ceremonies held on the plantation grounds. The Court Oak servants had been happy to recount marrow-chilling tales of duppies and zuvumbies for their young charges, but she'd never seen one. She'd never expected to either. The Llano Estacado was about as far from the moss-draped oaks of Louisiana as she could imagine, and Tontmere swore the Zuvembi only punishes the wicked, and I cannot believe everyone in Alsop was black with sin. Jett didn't know how long Nightingale had been running through the darkness when she saw lights ahead. The warm glow of a campfire, the paler light of kerosene lanterns. She must have made some movement Nightingale interpreted as a command, for he headed straight toward them. She barely had time to realize he might be running straight into a whole nest of zombies before he reached the edge of the circle of firelight. She recoiled in fear, and to her anguish, he took that as a signal to skid to a stop. She immediately realized why, for his head hung down and his breath whistled in his throat. His sides heaved as he struggled for air. Foam dripped from his mouth and covered his withers. All she wanted was to spur him on, put more distance between herself and the zombies. But she knew Nightingale had given her his all, and to force him onward would kill him. Standing before the fire were a living man and woman. The man took a step forward, obviously intending to grab Nightingale's rein. Had the zombies followed her out of Alsop? She had to warn them. "Stay back," she gasped. "Get your horses, get out of here, run. Now." There's her mouth spoke the word her mind still couldn't quite accept. "There's zombies behind me. A horde, an army of them, they're killing everything they see. Run, I tell you, run." She knew she had to keep going, there was no safety in the darkness. She would lead Nightingale onward. Surely he could walk, at least, anything to take them far from Alsop. She tried to swing down from the saddle, but her body would not obey her. She clawed desperately at the saddle horn, but she could not close her fingers around it. She felt herself swaying, slipping. Strong arms caught her and eased her fall. She tried to stay on her feet, but only managed to sink to her knees. "Run," she croaked. "Run." "You aren't going anywhere, my good woman," the female said briskly. "You're in no condition to fight off a kitten, and as for your animal, I think he is in worse shape than you. He needs rest and water." If there was anything that could have snapped Jett back to full consciousness, it was the stranger's words. Few had ever seen past Jett Gallatin to Philippa Sheridan, and none in a few moments by only the light of a fire. "Miss Gibbons is right," the young man agreed. "If there is trouble behind you, it cannot arrive quickly. And I think we have the means here to answer it," he added with a glance toward his companion. He held out a hand, which Jett used to lever herself to her feet. It was the hardest work she'd ever done to walk the few steps to the fire and seat herself on the wooden box the woman had been using for a seat. "My horse," she said. She needed to see to Nightingale. "Mr. Fox will see to your animal," Miss Gibbons said firmly. "He can't," Jett began, but Mr. Fox was already lifting her saddlebags from the saddle, and Nightingale let him. Has the world gone mad since sunset? Jett thought, numbly accepting the cup Miss Gibbons pushed into her hands. The coffee was hot and strong, and she sipped it greedily. With a few deft motions, Mr. Fox unbuckled the cinch and pulled the saddle from Nightingale's back. To Jett's great relief, for it needed to be done, and she knew she could not manage to do it herself, he did not stop there but picked up her saddle blanket, rubbed Nightingale briskly dry, and then began to walk him. "Now, tell us what happened to you, and without any supernatural fol-de-rol, if you please," Miss Gibbons said. "If I had $1 for every damn Yankee know-it-all I've met in the territories, I could buy them up at auction and get me a fancy box to put them in too," Jett snapped. "You think I'm lying. You just head back up the road to Alsop. You'll see." She reached up to tip her Stetson back and hissed in pain as her fingers brushed a bruise. "You re-injured?" Miss Gibbons exclaimed. "Had worse," Jett answered gruffly, but Miss Gibbons was already leaping to her feet. As she hurried off toward the back of her wagon, Jett realized that what she'd first taken for a skirt was actually some kind of odd pantalettes. "The world's gone mad," she repeated. "Perhaps it has," White Fox said quietly as he passed her. Nightingale walked behind him as tamely as a dog on a leash. "But whatever the cause, your injuries were not inflicted by what Miss Gibbons terms supernatural fol-de-rol. I told you to call me plain Gibbons, Mr. Fox, Miss Gibbons said crisply, returning with a carpetbag in her arms. To Jett's gratitude, not only was the first item she extracted from it a bottle of French brandy, but she poured a generous measure of it into Jett's coffee cup. When she'd finished, she soaked down a pad of cotton wool with the brandy and began dabbing at Jett's forehead. I can tend my own hurts, Jett snapped reflexively. Oh, don't be unreasonable, Miss Gibbons scolded. I dare swear you didn't even realize you were hurt until a moment ago. She made a grab for Jett's hat, and Jett removed it in self-defense. She always like this? She called toward Mr. Fox. I cannot say, he answered gravely, leading Nightingale back in her direction once more. My acquaintance with Gibbons is only a few hours old, so perhaps we should all introduce ourselves. I'm a scout for the 10th Cavalry. They call me White Fox. And I'm Honoria Gibbons, and I will take it kindly if you call me Gibbons, and not Miss or Miss Gibbons. And you are? Jett Gallatin, Jett answered. Folks who want a handle call me Mr. Gallatin. She hissed again as Gibbons poked a sore spot. Her neck and shoulders were covered with deep scratches, and she suspected she'd be black and blue in the morning. Oh, don't be such a baby, Gibbons said irritably. Jett endured further poking in silence until at last Gibbons sat back. Nothing more I can do without better light. You're from Louisiana, are you not? She added, as if the two ideas were somehow related. I was, Jett answered bleakly. She drained the last of her brandied coffee and, to her great relief, felt steady enough to get to her feet. She walked over to White Fox, who put the end of Nightingale's reins into Jett's hand. No matter how thirsty he might be, the stallion could not be allowed to drink until he'd cooled out. There was a paint mare browsing nearby, but no sign of a wagon team. She clutched the reins like a lifeline, then threw an arm across Nightingale's withers to steady herself and continued to walk him. If the other two continued their conversation, their voices were pitched too low for her to hear. At last, when he was cooled out enough that he wouldn't instantly founder if left to himself, Jett walked Nightingale down to the creek for a drink. She knelt on the bank beside him and splashed water over her face and neck, then unbuckled Nightingale's bridle and slipped it off. As he wandered over to the mare, she walked back to her saddlebags and saddle. Her shirt was in ruins and bloody besides. She located her other everyday shirt and tossed it over the saddle while she shrugged out of her frock coat and leather vest. She turned her back to the campfire as she pulled off the remains of her shirt. Gibbons and White Fox would see the muslin bandage wound around her torso to bind her breasts flat, but there was no help for it, and they already knew her secret. She pulled the shirt on and stuffed the hem into her trousers, then picked up her coat and vest and walked back to the fire. When she sat down, White Fox handed her another full cup of coffee, and she smelled the brandy in it when she raised it to her lips. I'd be dead now if it weren't for Nightingale, Jett said in a low voice. He fought them off. I don't know how many there were. I was in the saloon when they came, but they were all over the town. You called them zombies, White Fox prompted quietly. When the dead get up and walk again, that's what we call them, she answered tartly. As you say, Miss Gibbons, beg pardon, ma'am, I am. I was from New Orleans, from Orleans Parish, and we understand hoodoo there. I'd always heard conjure could call a man up out of his grave and make him do his caller's bidding. But closest I ever came was coming on a place, after. And if you don't believe in it, you tell me what could take both barrels of a Winchester in the chest and keep coming. I saw that with my own eyes. I don't know, Mr. Gallatin, but just because I don't know doesn't make those people you saw the reanimated dead, Gibbons said doggedly. Despite herself, Jett smiled at the other woman's stubborn fierceness. Reckon you might as well call me Jett, so we don't get ourselves all tangled up here, she said. But I'd take it kindly if you didn't tell all you know about me, she added. I would never betray a confidence, Gibbons said severely. You have my word. Appreciate it, Jett said. There's plenty of rannies who don't take kindly to this sort of thing, she said, waving a hand to indicate her outfit. Oh, men always object to being shown that a female is just as capable, just as competent as they are, Gibbons announced. But perhaps you would be so kind as to tell me everything you saw in Allsup tonight. And I am afraid we've eaten all the biscuits, but there are some beans left over from our supper, and I can open another can of peaches. Appreciate it, Jett said again. Bacon and hardtack gets a mite tedious after a time. By the time Jett finished her meal, Gibbons had extracted every detail of the attack on Allsup. Nothing Jett had told her seemed to have shaken her conviction that zombies did not exist. "Well, we'll see in the morning," was all she'd say. "One way or another," Jett said grimly. "The devil we will. I'm not going back there, and you're not going there either, you crazy female." A short while later Gibbons announced it was time for bed, and White Fox went to check on Deerfoot and wash up. Gibbons offered Jett space inside her wagon, but Jett merely shook her head, saying she wanted to sit up for a while. Whoever had gathered the wood for the fire had collected enough for a week, and Jett had no worry she'd deprive Gibbons of a breakfast fire no matter how much she burned. Gibbons retreated to the wagon, dousing the lanterns as she did, and soon afterward White Fox returned. Without his hat, and with his hair slicked back and damp from washing, he looked much younger than she'd originally thought. "A Yankee's still a Yankee," she told herself stubbornly, and I seem to have fallen into a nest of M. She couldn't manage to work up her usual anger at the invaders who'd destroyed her home and her family, tonight though. Bad as they might be, they weren't as bad as the unquiet dead. White Fox unrolled his bedroll under the wagon with a quiet word of good night, and soon the little camp was utterly still. Jett tossed another chunk of wood onto the fire and poured the last of the coffee into her cup, tipping the pot upside down to let the grounds empty. When she finished drinking, she took pot and cup down to the creek to rinse them clean. She'd put her vest back on earlier, but now she shrugged into her frock coat, wincing a bit. She was stiff and aching, and every movement told her about some new place she was bruised. But she knew if she didn't move around, she'd just stiffen further. And she was alive. That was more than she'd expected earlier. There was a full moon tonight, and the sky was bright with stars. In the distance a coyote gave tongue, soon joined by a chorus. Derned critters always sound like their hearts re-breaking, she thought, grumbling under her breath. Don't know what they got to cry about. I never heard tell of a coyote army nor a coyote war. When she came back to the campfire, she stacked the dishes neatly on one of the boxes, then went to collect the rest of her gear and put it in order. Her saddle blanket was still damp, so she hunted around until she found a branch sturdy enough to hang it from. When she took a seat by the fire once more, she shook out her ruined shirt and folded it carefully before tucking it into her saddlebags. Maybe she'd come across some town with a laundry where she could get it washed and mended, if it was worth repairing at all. If it wasn't, she could always use it for rags. She was relieved her cigarette case hadn't been a casualty of her fight this evening. It was gold, with an ace picked out on the front in diamonds, and she'd won it in a card game. Someday she might need to sell it if she couldn't raise the wind any other way. But until then it added to her masquerade as a prosperous and indolent gambler. She opened it and extracted a thin black cheroot and picked up a bit of wood to light it. Mom'd have the vapors to see me using tobacco, Jett thought sadly, and Pop'd whoop me till I couldn't sit down. Gentlemen smoked and ladies did not, before the war. She'd been too young to smoke when she'd been playing the boy. But it was one of the things that helped make her masquerade convincing. She wondered sometimes if it was really a masquerade anymore. The fire popped loudly, and she jerked in alarm, heart racing. White Fox and Honoria Gibbons were both sound asleep, but they hadn't seen what Jett had seen. She didn't think she'd sleep at all, and she didn't want to either. She'd keep watch and kill two birds with one stone. She turned so she was sitting with her back to the fire and stretched her legs out in front of her. It was where White Fox found her when dawn began to brighten the sky. He'd slept lightly, as he always did, and a part of him expected the young gunslinger to have crept away in the night. But when he rolled out from under the wagon, he found her feeding the fire back to life. "Got some arbuckles in my kit," she said, seeing him. "Figure I could add some bacon to those beans too." White Fox nodded silently. After he'd washed, he made a wide circle around Gibbons's wagon, but he saw no sign that any creature who did not belong here had approached in the night. When he returned, Jett had sliced several chunks of bacon into the beans left over from last night's meal, and the coffee pot was already heating. He raided his own supplies for salt and meal, and by the time Gibbons appeared, breakfast was all but ready. In the light of morning, Jett had a better view of Gibbons's outlandish costume. There was actually more than one, for last night's outfit had been royal blue, and today's was a vibrant scarlet. It consisted of voluminous pantalettes that clearly revealed her legs, because they were gathered tightly at her ankles. Over it she wore a long tunic with soutache embroidery across the bosom and shoulders, and beneath that tunic a white muslin blouse. It was entirely obvious that Gibbons was not wearing a corset of any kind. "I see you are admiring my rational dress," Gibbons said proudly. "It was invented by Miss Libby Miller, a noted female suffrage activist, to free women from the tyranny of corsets and petticoats. I confess I am disappointed it has not been more enthusiastically adopted," she added, looking momentarily crestfallen. "But you of all people will certainly see how much more convenient it is to have the freedom of one's limbs." "It's very rational," Jett said awkwardly. Jett might dress as a man, but privately she longed for the pretty and fashionable dresses she'd left behind. She thought Gibbons's costume was the ugliest thing she had ever seen in her life, but she could not bear to hurt Gibbons's feelings by saying so. "You can't sit a horse in that," she added, feeling something more was called for. "Can you?" "Certainly not," Gibbons agreed merrily. "My auto-tacopode is far more efficient. I have every faith that someday they will be as widespread as rational dress, and horses will be a thing of the past." "Doubtless you know best about that," Jett said dryly. She drank coffee for a few moments in silence. "Tell me, have you thought better of this nonsensical idea of yours? If by that you mean do I intend to give up my idea of seeing Alsop for myself, I certainly have not," Gibbons said. "It is Mr. Fox's destination as well, not that I require his protection in the least." "Oh, of course not," Jett muttered. "But you cannot mean to go to Alsop, White Fox," she added, turning to him. "I know Gibbons does not believe me, but you, at least, must know I am not lying." Perhaps if he changed his mind, Gibbons would change hers. "I must," White Fox said. "My trail leads there, and I must find answers, no matter the cost. Many people, Negroes, whites, and Indians, have gone missing of late. Perhaps your zombies are the cause. Perhaps you'll just end up missing too," Jett grumbled. "Really, you are the most fearful gunslinger I have ever met," Gibbons said sternly. "Why? You said yourself the creatures fear daylight. We shall be perfectly safe." "Well, if you're going to Alsop, I reckon I'm going with you," Jett said. Even if Gibbons was a crazy damn Yankee and White Fox worked for the Bluebellies, she couldn't let them ride into danger by themselves. "Can't stop you," Gibbons said cheerfully. Jett was beginning to think Honoria Gibbons did everything cheerfully. "I'm about to start the auto-tacopode. You'll want to move well away. Your horses will not appreciate the commotion," Gibbons called, stepping up into the back of the wagon. She didn't wait to see whether White Fox and Jett took her advice. If they didn't this time, they certainly would in the future. Horses simply didn't seem to like the auto-tacopode. Wagons such as this one normally provided a tidy and weatherproof traveling home for their owners. But while Gibbons thought of this as more her home than her suite of rooms in her papa's Russian Hill townhouse, even she had to admit it was cramped. Most of the interior was taken up with the Gatling guns and their firing mechanism, and with the auto-tacopode's motive mechanism, a collection of cogwheels, pulleys, and pistons as elaborate as the interior of a Swiss watch. But while one might wind a watch to permit it to function, the auto-tacopode's motive power came from steam. A steam boiler, a marvel of miniaturization, and her own invention, allowed the auto-tacopode to function. She had filled the reservoir last night as soon as it had cooled, and had begun stoking it even before she had dressed to greet the day. She consulted the pressure gauges with a critical eye. The boiler had built up a good head of steam. Everything was in readiness. She exited the back of the wagon again, being careful to latch the doors firmly behind her. She had no interest in chasing her boxes of supplies over half the desert, and even less in being laughed at by her two companions. She was pleased to see Jett, and White Fox had taken her warning seriously. They were on the far side of the creek, watching the proceedings with curiosity. She walked around to the front of the wagon and took her place on the wooden bench. While the bench itself had been part of the wagon's original structure, that was the last thing about it that was conventional. She pulled the gleaming wooden tiller toward her and ran her hand over the small forest of brass levers installed at the right-hand side of the seat. "It is not that I am nervous," she told herself. "I simply wish this to be a true exhibition of the mechanism's capabilities. Here goes nothing," she muttered under her breath. She grasped the largest of the brass levers and pulled back on it strongly. The moment she released the clutch, there was an ear-splitting shriek of released steam, followed by the clattering, banging racket of churning pistons. The entire wagon began to shake violently. "Are you all right?" Jett shouted anxiously to her. "Never better," Gibbons shouted back. She released the brake. The shaking stopped, replaced with a low mechanical vibration, and to her secret glee, the auto-tachopode began to move forward with majestic grace. She pulled the tiller toward her gently, and it turned toward the stream. At that point, both horses thought better of remaining where they were. They didn't bolt, but their riders were forced to wheel them about and trot them further away. As the auto-tachopode bumped gently down into the stream bed, Gibbons congratulated herself once again at having had the forethought to augment the wagon's wooden wheels with tires of vulcanized rubber. Not only did their textured surfaces provide additional traction, the rubber acted as a sort of shock absorber and provided a smoother ride. The wagon climbed the far bank as easily as it had descended the near one, and began chugging its way toward Alsop at a stately 2 miles per hour. At first the horses would have nothing to do with the strange contraption, but after half an hour or so they were willing to walk alongside it, apparently having decided it was some odd new variety of locomotive. Gibbons happily answered her companion's questions about her invention, though she privately doubted she'd won any converts to this new method of transport. Jett thought it was too slow, and White Fox thought it was too noisy, though both of them agreed a steam engine that did not have to have tracks laid for it was of a certain amount of use. "It is only a prototype, after all," Gibbons said. "Once it has been thoroughly tested, I shall build one capable of sustaining a higher operating speed, and even of pulling a number of wagons behind it." She did not think it was worth mentioning just now that the auto-tachopode was capable of attaining a speed in excess of 15 miles an hour, though it was a risky business, as it required the engine to build up such a head of steam that it was in constant danger of exploding. It was true that the main body of the boiler had been cast in one piece to avoid precisely that, but Gibbons had a healthy respect for the dangerous power of live steam. She had seen far too many deadly accidents at the locomotive yards where she'd researched her invention. It was mid-morning by the time they reached Alsop, and Jett would have thought she'd dreamed the previous night's attack, except for the fact that not so much as a barking dog greeted their extremely noisy arrival. In a way, she was grateful for the noise that contraption of Gibbons produced. It kept things from being so quiet she'd turn tail and run for it. "I'm going to check the livery stable," Jett shouted over the racket of the auto-tachopode. White Fox raised a hand to indicate he'd heard, and she spurred ahead toward the stables. This isn't right, she thought as she dismounted. The corrals outside the building were deserted, though the horses should have already been turned out for the day. The stable doors were open, and she entered warily, one hand on her gun butt. The interior was dark. No one left a lantern unattended in a barn full of hay, but enough sun shone through the doorway to show her rows of stalls, some with saddles hung on the partitions. But there were no horses here anywhere. No horses and no people. She made a quick and careful circuit of the stable's interior. The bunk in the cubby where the hostlers slept was cold, and so was the pot-bellied stove. She picked up the enamelware coffee pot on top of it and looked inside. The coffee had cooked down to sludge before the stove went out. Would have been a full pot around sundown, she mused. Looks like there wasn't anybody left around to drink it, though. She checked the tiny house built out behind the stable. Most shopkeepers lived over their stores, but the owner of a livery stable couldn't do that. The bed was made, and there was no pot on the stove, but that was the only difference between the house and the hostler's cubby. She shivered despite herself, and hurried back to where Nightingale stood waiting patiently. "Not even a stable cat," she said to him as she swung back into the saddle. "That isn't right." As she headed back to the others, there was a sound Jett and Nightingale were both familiar with. The ear-splitting whistle of escaping steam that meant a boiler being vented. It was clear Gibbons meant to stop here a while. "Just as long as we clear out by sunset," Jett thought worriedly. She didn't know the zombies would return with sunset, but she didn't know they wouldn't either. By the time Jett rejoined them, Gibbons had done whatever she needed to do to prepare the auto-tachopode for an extended period of inactivity. Deerfoot was drinking thirstily from the half-empty water trough outside the saloon, and White Fox leaned against the hitching rail glancing watchfully around himself. Jett swung down from Nightingale's back and flipped his reins up over his saddle horn. He shook himself all over like an enormous dog, nosed at her shoulder companionably, and ambled over to the water trough. "This is where you were when you were attacked?" White Fox asked quietly. Jett favored him with a sardonic smile. "Reckon that smashed window tells the tale," she said, tipping back her Stetson. "Then come along," Gibbons said, jumping down from the wagon's bench. It is time to begin investigating your story. Jett opened her mouth to say it wasn't a story. It was the unvarnished gospel truth, and closed it again. Gibbons would find out soon enough. But when she followed Gibbons in through the saloon's batwing doors, for a moment Jett doubted herself as much as Gibbons obviously did. There'd been a fight here for certain, tables and chairs were broken and overturned. But the saloon was utterly empty of both the living and the dead. "This can't be," she said slowly. "Oh, don't distress yourself, my good Jett," Gibbons said airily. "Unless one is trained in the principles of scientific observation, it's very easy to." "Someone died here," White Fox said quietly. "More than one, I think." He knelt in the sawdust that covered the floor. On an ordinary evening, it would have been swept out onto the street at the end of the night, and fresh would have scattered before the saloon opened in the morning. But last night's sawdust still covered the floor. It was scuffed and scattered, but in several places it had been darkened with blood. So much blood that the blood-soaked sawdust had stuck to the floor as it dried. He brushed the floor clear around the darkened places to reveal the wood was blood-soaked as well. "Nobody bleeds that much and gets up to go dancing," Jett said sharply. "Still doesn't mean they were killed by zombies," Gibbons answered cheerfully. "Then where in tarnation is everybody in this darn town?" Jett shouted, rounding on her. "You couldn't punch a lady, but oh, how she wanted to. Answer me that if you're so smart." "Just because I don't know doesn't mean you're right," Gibbons shouted back, a matching fire in her own eyes. "You want some damn Yankee notion of evidence." Jett strode across the floor to a charred crater in the plaster wall. "Here's where the barkeep put both barrels into one of those things." She spied something on the floor and pounced on it. "And here's the axe he tried next." The blade was still clean. "Post hoc ergo propter hoc. All that proves is that there was a saloon brawl," Gibbons answered, her eyes flashing dangerously. "After this, therefore because of this." Jett wondered if it would improve Gibbons's opinion of her to know Jett was probably as fluent in Latin as she was. It hadn't been considered feminine for a girl to have much book learning. But as the lone girl on an isolated plantation, Jett had shared everything with her brothers, including their school days. "If you say so," Jett answered, throwing up her hands. She turned to step out onto the street again. Zombies or no zombies, the deserted saloon gave her the willies, but she suddenly noticed something. "Hey, where'd White Fox get to?" The indignantly baffled look on Gibbons's face did much to restore Jett's good humor, even if it did nothing to answer her question. She was about to suggest they go looking for him. She had no intention of leaving Gibbons alone, even if Allsup seemed deserted, when White Fox walked in through the doorway that led to the saloon's back room. "There's no one upstairs," he said. "All the rooms are empty." "Then the whole place is empty," Gibbons said briskly. "Let's keep looking." The main street of Allsup contained a general store, a dining parlor and boarding house, a feed and grain, a bank, a telegraph and post office, a newspaper office, and a jail. The church was about a mile outside of town, and a few houses, probably owned by the few citizens of Allsup who did not live above or behind their businesses or workplaces, formed a ragged line between the church and the town. Jett had already checked the livery stable, and the church was far enough away that the three of them were in unspoken agreement to save it for last. By the time they'd checked the first few establishments, it was clear there was no one at all in Allsup. The three of them split up to search more quickly. Jett frowned as she gazed around the general store. When the sun set, Jett intended to be far away from Allsup. What she found almost more unsettling than the complete absence of living things was the fact that nothing else seemed to have been disturbed. Just walked off and locked everything up behind them when they did. She'd had to smash the glass pane in the door to get in. "No, wait," she thought. "I saw those things come walking out this door last night plain as day. Maybe the people of Allsup were still here, hiding. They might not have come out for the noise of Gibbons's steam-driven whirligig. But," she drew her pistol and ran out into the street. Pointing its barrel skyward, she pulled the trigger over and over again. Gibbons and White Fox came running at the sound of gunfire, staring at her incredulously. "Wait," Jett said urgently, before either of them could speak. The three of them stood in silence for several seconds. And then, faint and distant, they heard the sound of shouting. The shouting continued, indistinct but vigorous, and they finally traced it to its source, the jail. Jett stepped in front of Gibbons and opened the door, gun drawn. "Well, it's about time," the man in the cell said irritably. "Where's Sheriff Mitchell?" He was supposed to give me my breakfast, not to mention my supper, and let me out of here hours ago. The cell's occupant was unshaven and disheveled, his long silver hair curling down over his shoulders. He wore a frock coat and a brocade vest, though the string tie and starched collar that should have completed the outfit were missing. But even though he looked disreputable, he was clean. "First things first," Gibbons said crisply, stepping around Jett and walking up to the door. "Who are you?" "Finley Maxwell," the man answered, drawing himself up proudly. "I have the honor and privilege to be the town drunk of this fine metropolis, a position I have held for the last 4 years. It is a sign of civilization for a society to be able to support truly useless individuals such as I. Don't seem like there'd be much money in being a drunk," Jett said quickly. If Gibbons decided to lecture Maxwell on the evils of drink, they'd never get anything out of him. "Dear sir, I am an actor by profession," Maxwell said haughtily. "Dare I say it, a celebrated thespian who has performed before the crowned heads of Europe. It was the most trifling misunderstanding about the disposition of the receipts from our highly successful Western engagement that caused my theatrical troupe to decamp without me." "A trifling misunderstanding, I'm certain," Gibbons said dryly. "But certainly they didn't lock you up here when they left." "Certainly not, my good woman. I do not scruple to admit that, every now and then, I am forced to rely on Sheriff Mitchell's kind hospitality. And yesterday was one such occasion. I had barely arisen from my healing slumber in the embrace of the grape when the night was made clangorous with the sound of guns. Naturally, Sheriff Mitchell and his minion, the worthy Deputy Aldine, sallied forth to deal with the fuss, never to return. And what I saw thereafter I can barely credit." He paused dramatically. "Well," Jett demanded. "My dear young man, you can hardly expect me to summon the angels of memory in my parched and famished state," Maxwell said. Gibbons gave a sharp huff of annoyance and thrust her hand into the pocket of her voluminous pantaloons. She extracted a small silver flask and thrust it toward the bars. Maxwell plucked it from her grasp, deftly unscrewed the cap, and drained it at a single gulp. He sighed with deep satisfaction as he handed it back. "As I said, there was a good deal of gunfire," Maxwell continued, "and more shouting than I cared for. I kept a lookout through my window." He gestured behind him toward the barred window in the back wall of his cell. "And after about a quarter of an hour, the town was silent. But the revelations of the evening were not complete, for there, passing outside my coign of vantage, came a vast and silent army." "What sort of army, Mr. Maxwell?" White Fox asked. "As to that, my dear lad, I cannot fairly say. They all appeared to be sick, or drunk, and I assure you, ma'am and sirs, the celebrated Finley Maxwell, Esquire, is a connoisseur of the inebriated state. Regardless of their condition, I was about to bestir myself to beseech them to relieve my unjust confinement when I saw that a number of them were carrying bodies. And so I decided that tessera, as the Greeks would say, was the better part of virtue. I kept my vigil in silence, and it was just as well I did, for there was one last mystery to unfold." He paused again. "You might as well tell us everything now, Mr. Maxwell, because I'm out of brandy," Gibbons said. "Ah, yes, but you still hold within your gift that pearl beyond price, freedom," Maxwell said, gesturing toward the wall. White Fox took down the ring of keys Maxwell had indicated. He moved toward the cell, but Gibbons plucked the keys from his hand before he could open the cell door. "Your mystery, if you please, Mr. Maxwell," she said, holding the keys up meaningfully. "Oh, very well," Maxwell grumbled ungraciously. "I watched the nightmare army depart Alsop, and the stench of the grave was in my nostrils. I knew then that I was in the presence of the legions of hell, my own life spared by divine providence. And yet, that ghastly army of the dead possessed a living general, for I saw him with my own eyes urging them onward. I know no more." "I was right," Jett said smugly. "That still doesn't make them reanimated dead," Gibbons said stubbornly. "Plague, autohypnosis, drugs, or outright fakery, there's a perfectly reasonable scientific explanation. I just need to find it. Whatever it is Mr. Maxwell saw," White Fox said with calm certainty, "it has left a trail I can read." He took the keys back from Gibbons and unlocked the cell. When he swung the door wide, Finley Maxwell strode through it, glaring at all three of them reproachfully. "Hectoring a starving man, withholding not mere sustenance, but the very waters of life. I hope you're properly ashamed of yourselves, the lot of you." Still grumbling, he made his way to the door of the jail and disappeared up the street. Where do you suppose he's going? White Fox asked curiously. Probably straight to the saloon to drink himself blind, Jett answered. Can you really track them? Living or dead, by your own testimony they are corporeal beings, he answered. They will leave some trace of their passage that I can follow. The trail will be easiest to follow if I start at once. I will return as quickly as I may. You mean we, Mr. Fox? Anyone who's looking for trouble had best have company doing it. Will you be all right here by yourself? Jett asked, even though, since Alsop was currently zombie-free, she knew Gibbons should be perfectly safe. She knew she ought to mount up and ride away right now. But White Fox had already made it clear he was staying, or at least coming back. She just couldn't leave him to deal with this by himself. And she'd be lying if she didn't admit, at least to herself, that he was mighty easy on the eyes. But the same things that made it possible for Jett to masquerade as a boy were the same things that guaranteed someone like White Fox wouldn't look twice at her, even if he did know her true sex. She was too tall, too skinny, and dark like her Creole great-grandmother. While Gibbons was small and plump and blonde, and those big blue eyes of hers could stop any beau dead in his tracks as quickly as a bullet from one of Jett's pistols. Quicker. I've been fending for myself since you cut your milk teeth, Jett Gallatin, Gibbons said derisively and inaccurately. Just be sure to bring me back one of your zombies. If you actually find one. Jett had been about to sigh for, can't be, and never happen, when Gibbons's remark made her exchange a disbelieving glance with White Fox. When she turned to give Gibbons the full force of her incredulous stare, she realized Gibbons hadn't noticed White Fox's considerable charms. White Fox might have been Finley Maxwell for all the consciousness of him Gibbons displayed. Surely, White Fox began disbelievingly. Surely I need one of them to find out how they tick, Mr. Fox. She regarded both of them stubbornly. Do you or do you not want this mystery solved? Well, I am the only person here with the scientific training to discover how these so-called zombies came to be. If they exist at all, she added with a snort. They do. You just wait and see, Jett said, more cheerfully than the subject probably called for.